If you're a founder, you know that fundraising is a big part of the job. What you might not know is that Carta is there to help. Carta's new fundraising suite provides startups of all stages the best tools and support to easily issue safes, accurately forecast dilution, and quickly close funding rounds. Save time, money, and make your next round your best yet. To learn more or to get started, go to carta.com/fundraise. That's carta.com/fundraise.
The IKEA Business Network is now open for small businesses and entrepreneurs. Take your small business to the next level when you sign up for IKEA Business Network for free today at IKEA.com.
Welcome to Inc. for Starters with Alexa Von Tobel. I'm Alexa, a serial entrepreneur myself and founder and managing partner of Inspired Capital, a venture firm that backs fearless founders who are solving some of the biggest challenges facing humanity. Now in our 6th season, we sit down each week with one of the best founders on the planet to hear their story of guts, inspiration, and drive. Let's dive right in. Hi, everybody. I'm your host, Alexa Von Tobel, and this week I'm excited for you to meet Sir Peter Beck, the founder, CEO, and chief engineer of Rocket Lab, a Nasdaq-listed leading launch and space systems company opening access to space to improve life on Earth. Peter started Rocket Lab in 2006 and has grown the company into a global organization of 1,800 people that went public in 2021 with a market cap north of $2.5 billion. Rocket Lab's capabilities span the space economy, including satellite design and manufacture, industry-leading spacecraft, software and components, and reliable launch services. Under Peter's leadership, Rocket Lab's Electron launch vehicle has become the most successful small launch vehicle globally, and Rocket Lab's satellite subsystems have featured 1,700 missions. Rocket Lab works with a range of global mission partners, including NASA, the United States Space Force, DARPA, and the National Reconnaissance Office, among others. Prior to founding Rocket Lab, Peter began his career in 1993 with an apprenticeship as a precision engineer at a global appliance manufacturer. In his own time, Peter began building rockets at an early age, steadily increasing their size and complexity. Peter is an award-winning engineer, and earlier this year, he was made Knight of Companion of New Zealand Order of Merit for services to the aerospace industry, business, and education. And with that, let's welcome Sir Peter Beck. Peter, first of all, I'm so excited to have you on today. You are my first really big space entrepreneur, which is incredible. I've always been obsessed with outer space ever since I was little. Literally used to watch shooting stars, rockets launching from Florida. We'd go to NASA. Total nerd. I want to start from the beginning. What's Rocket Lab in your own words? And let's go back to the founding story.
Gosh, well, you'd have to roll back history for quite some time. I'm from a little town at the very bottom of the South Island of New Zealand. And as a little kid, I was always interested in two things, really, space and engineering. So my desire was to work in the space industry. And from a little town in the bottom of New Zealand, the opportunities to do that in New Zealand was zero. And so really, I focused my dreams on going to work for NASA, as all young kids probably do. But I worked through various kind of positions and roles, and started off and did a trade in tool and die making, and then moved into a government lab doing advanced materials and structures. And anyway, cut a long story short, I went on a bit of a rocket pilgrimage back in 2008. And went and visited a whole lot of the companies that I'd dreamed of working for, and visited NASA and all those kinds of things. And at the end of that visit, really, two things became really obvious. One, a non-degreed New Zealand citizen, it's very, very difficult to get a job at NASA. There's in our industry, there's a lot of crossover between defence work, so it's very difficult as a foreign national to work in the space industry, and let alone nobody somebody without a degree. So I had really no option but to come home and just start a space company and do it myself. So, that's how it all got started.
How do you start a rocket company? What was the first year like? What were the big moves?
Really, the hardest thing with starting any company is just to start it. So once I'd sort of just made the resolve to begin, it was all about building credibility and capability. So the first project we had was to send a small rocket into space. And we actually became the first private company in the Southern Hemisphere to ever reach space, not into orbit, just into space. And then following that, that got the attention of a number of folks. And then we started working for the larger defense primes and space companies like Lockheed Martin and some of the US government research agencies. And then it wasn't really until kind of 2013 where I really felt we had the credibility and capability to go to Silicon Valley and try and raise money for the Electron rocket. I was still in New Zealand, and I knew absolutely nothing about how Silicon Valley worked. So I gave myself like 3 weeks to come home with a check or be run out of town. And I arrived in Silicon Valley, and I spent the first week, talking to various entrepreneurs and companies to try and figure out how this whole venture capital game worked. And then the second week I actually pitched to 3 venture capital firms. And then the third week I did in fact come home with a check. And these were in the times where, raising $5 million for your space startup was a really hard thing to do. It's not like...
Very hard thing to do.
Very hard to do. It's not like in 2021 or 2020 where you just needed a PowerPoint and you can come home with, tens of millions of dollars and in some cases even $100 million. It's craziness. So those were very, very different times. And I look back on that and think, man, that first investment was by Vinod Khosla. And here was this kid with, once again, no degree from a country with no space heritage, looking to, build a rocket and take on the giants of the industry. So it was a big, bold move by Vinod.
For those listening, can you help them understand what are examples of the things that you've built and that you've launched into space, and what solution were you providing before anybody else was?
Absolutely. So we started with small launch, and I named the company Rocket Lab. I probably should have called it Space Lab because we do way, way more than that. But we started off with small launch, and right now our small launch rocket Electron is the third most frequently launched rocket in the world.
Wow.
So our friends over at SpaceX launch the most, then it goes China, then it goes us and Rocket Lab. But we do a lot more than that. What we're trying to build here as a space company is an end-to-end space company. And when I say end-to-end, I mean, if you think about the services that you use from space, our lives are completely changed and improved by all the infrastructure on orbit. But a lot of people who are trying to put infrastructure on orbit are not natural owners of space infrastructure. And the one challenge with the space industry is if you just want to provide a dumb old service like communications to an island in the Pacific, you have to become literally world experts in both spacecraft design and operation, launch, and all of those kinds of things. Now, the trouble with that is that's a very high barrier to a market entry. And what we're trying to do is by combining both the build of spacecraft, the launch of spacecraft, and also the operation of spacecraft, as a country or a business can literally come to us and say, hey, we want this service, we want this communication service over this Pacific island. And then we go out and we build the spacecraft using all our own components. Then we launch the spacecraft and we can operate the spacecraft for that particular customer and just provide the service. And for probably most of your listeners, that just sounds like the normal thing that you would expect. But in the space industry, it's completely the opposite. I mean, you procure a spacecraft and then you procure a launch and then, you have all the ground stations and on and on and on it goes. So we're really trying to democratize space in a totally different way.
You just said something really important, which is you said by parts that you built yourself. Tell us a little bit about how you innovated on this spacecraft.
The way to think of the space industry, it's a conglomerate of ma and pa shops, all at subscale. Take just one example, a reaction wheel supplier, and say, I want 1,000 reaction wheels. You can just watch everybody's head simultaneously explode. Because the whole industry is used to building like 10 a year, not 1,000 a year. So what we did is we went and we both created some of this capability, and then we also acquired a whole bunch of these companies, and now we can provide spacecraft components at scale, not just for ourselves, but for our customers. And literally, just about anything that you can imagine, whether it's on the spacecraft or the rocket, we build it. In fact, 38% of everything that was launched last year that we can touch had a Rocket Lab logo on it somewhere.
Wow.
So it's really important to make these parts available at scale to the industry.
In startup world, I built startups. It's move fast, go quickly.
Yep.
We're talking launching rockets into outer space. There's really no margin for error, right? And it's extremely expensive to make mistakes. How do you balance execution and speed? And how did you set the dial on that for the momentum of the DNA of the company?
Oh man, this is really like a multi-hour drive, because you're exactly right. Like you, I'm involved in a bunch of other startups as well. It's kind of my mental therapy outside Rocket Lab.
An addiction.
Yeah.
It's an addiction.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Yeah, like in many companies, the move fast, break stuff model is really, really important. At Rocket Lab, we certainly move fast and break things, but at a component level. Because when it gets into a subsystem level, when you put a whole bunch of things together, you're exactly right. At that point, the subassembly you're standing in front can be worth millions of dollars and take 6 months to build. So you really can't afford to have that fail. And I think that's the secret of the success of the company is we've been able to walk that line really finely between taking risk, also learning fast. But when it comes to actually putting something on the pad, we all expect it to work perfectly. That's not an easy thing to do. And the best way I can describe a space startup, especially a rocket one, is it's like running through a maze at night. But at every dead end, there's literally a cliff. So if you run too fast, you're going to just fall off that cliff and you're dead. So, you have to run fast, but you also have to be prepared to stop really, really quickly. We kind of joke here, it's like the rocket gods, because the rocket gods, you have to appease them, but they're there to punish you at every turn.
Can you give us a sense of what was the hardest day? If you look back at the last now almost 20 years, what would you say was the thing you were most proud of overcoming?
At the very beginning, I used to really worry about, technical execution and could we pull this off? And then we just kept pulling stuff off, time and time and time and time and time again. And we built such an amazing engineering team that now I don't really worry about can we pull this off. Sometimes it takes longer than we expect, but there's been nothing that we can ever not pull off. Going to the moon was we can talk about that story, but going to the moon was like the ultimate of over your skis moment. And then you'll go through a period like where you're raising capital and you're watching the countdown clock and all the people around you and what you need to do and you have to raise capital or you die. Probably these days, the most challenging moments are if you have a launch failure. And we've been fortunate that we haven't had many in our career, but they do happen occasionally. And when they happen, it is just everybody pours their heart and their soul into every launch. And when do have a launch failure, it's like walking around a morgue. I mean, it is soul crushing. Making sure you can pick the team back up and move on is important.
We are in such an interesting moment in time as we think about space and what's possible. And I've nerdily read a bunch of books on what's possible and where we could go. And I would love just to get your point of view as if we fast forward 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. What do you see that maybe the rest of us can't see?
I think the biggest thing to be done in space is yet to even be thought of. And the trouble with space infrastructure is it's all hidden, so nobody sees it. But I challenge you, if we turn off the GPS constellation, let's just watch the world descend into chaos. And, and I think, like I say, the biggest thing to be done in space is not even thought of. And that is going to be huge for humanity. And really, I'd look at space as kind of parallel to AI. It is literally that transformational. I used to, when I was young, I used to really be annoyed and lament that I was growing up in the era that I was, because I really honestly believed that the Apollo era where, we sent people to the moon was like the premium time to be in space. But I mean, I think right now is really the premium time because we have flipped over from it being a government-dominated domain to being a commercially dominated domain. And, just as, our forefathers jumped on a ship and kind of set out into the unknown, this is pretty much where we're at with space. So I think, it's tremendously exciting and, your future for us, not just from a commercial standpoint, but also from a human exploration.
Can you give us a sense of like one of the craziest things that you think is possible in our lifetime that maybe people who are not spending all their time running a rocket company?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one very close to me, and it's something that we are actually having a crack at, is looking for life in the solar system and the universe. And I think that's a really important question to ask and answer, because if we truly are the only life in the universe, then that's something pretty special. If life is prolific in the universe, then I think you can take a different view on the world and your existence. So we have a Life Finder project to search for life in the clouds of Venus, because there is a very narrow region in the Venus clouds where it's possible that a form of life could exist, and there has been some evidence of that. So we have this personal project. It's a nights and weekends kind of purely privately funded mission to go to Mars and descend a probe into the atmosphere, and we literally have a go, no-go test for life. And I think if that question can be answered, I think that fundamentally changes, humanity's outlook upon itself. Maybe I'm weird, but I think every time that I stand outside with somebody and look at the night sky, that the questions that always start to get asked are like, wow, I wonder if we're alone in this giant universe here. I wonder if there's other intelligent people looking back at me. And if there is intelligent life, can it kind of transcend between planets and solar systems and all the rest of it? And I just think it's kind of human nature to kind of answer the question, like, where are we from? Are we unique? Are we special? And, there is, like I say, of all of the things in our solar system, Venus and, a very narrow band in the atmosphere has the potential to hold life. And I think if you can go to Venus and you can determine that, yes, there is life there, then you can pretty much draw the conclusion that actually life is prolific throughout the universe. Because if it can survive in this like little narrow beam, then it's probably prolific throughout the universe. But if we're taking the scientific method as it stands today, we have zero evidence of any other life other than us. So at the moment, from a scientific standpoint, we are the only life in the universe. And I just think that's a really important question for humanity to ask and answer.
I always say that I believe one of the core tenets of humanity is that we are inquisitive and explorers
Exactly.
by nature.
Yep.
Peter, I want to ask a question, which is, if you think about the most important innovation for space in the last decade, how would you describe that?
Well, so it's not in rocket engines. I think from a rocket, everybody looks at a rocket engine because it's the bit that makes a lot of noise and fire comes out the bottom, and it's a hard thing to build, for sure.
And it's pretty cool.
not
It's pretty
super
cool.
Actually, the measure of efficiency, which is combustion efficiency or C-star, hasn't really changed tremendously since the 1950s. And we've kind of extracted the most amount of chemical energy you can. So it's like 98% thereabouts efficient. So you've only got a small amount of efficiency to gain before you've reached chemical equilibrium. Like there is nothing more you can get. So I think most people think it's a rocket engine, but I think, no, it's not the rocket engine because we've already kind of reached chemical equilibrium. The most impactful thing is actually materials. Like somewhere between 2 and 5% of the total rocket's mass or weight is actually the thing you put in orbit. 92% of it, or 90 to 92% of it, is fuel. So it's just a big sack of fuel. And then the rest is structure. So if you can take 2% out of your structure and add it to your payload, you can literally double the payload performance of your rocket by removing, the mass out of your structure. So at Rocket Lab, we use exclusively, carbon composite materials, and these new materials that really move that needle. But I think that's probably the biggest needle mover that's available to us, aside from just ditching chemical propulsion altogether and going into, beamed energy or nuclear or some way out stuff.
And we'll be right back after a message from our sponsors. Alexa here. Not only do I get the opportunity to speak with all types of founders on For Starters, but I'm a repeat founder myself. We all know how vital fundraising is to a startup. Carta knows this too. That's why they had founders in mind when they created their fundraising suite, providing tools and support to take the friction out of fundraising. They save founders time and money, allowing you to focus on your goals, not the admin work needed to close a round. From simply issuing safes to quickly receiving funds, Carta Fundraising Suite helps their cap table customers raise a better fundraising round. To learn more or to get started, go to carta.com/fundraise. That's carta.com/fundraise.
The IKEA Business Network is now open for small businesses and entrepreneurs. Join for free today to get access to interior design services to help you make the most of your workspace, and employee well-being benefits that will help you and your people grow, as well as amazing discounts on travel, insurance, IKEA purchases, deliveries, and more. Take your small business to the next level when you sign up for the IKEA Business Network for free today at IKEA.com.
I want to transition to you, Sir Peter Beck. When you look back at your childhood to today, can you give us a sense of what do you think happened in your childhood? Something that dramatically shaped you to prepare you to do what you do today?
Well, I mean, I think it has to be my parents and my upbringing, because in the Beck household, there was no such thing as an idea too big or an ambition too great. And, I can remember that my parents were called into the school to have a meeting with the guidance counselors or the careers advisors, because they all believed that my ambitions were far too unrealistic. And it turned out that I was really good with my hands, so I should go to the local aluminium smelter and be a welder. So they called my parents into the school and we had this discussion. I remember my parents just sat there nodding, and then on the way home, I wasn't sure if I was in trouble or not. And they were like, well, that's just a load of rubbish. You go and do what you want. So, there was never kind of a limit to ambition within our family. It was always, if I come home and said, I'm going to build a rocket engine, it wouldn't be, well, be careful about that, don't burn yourself or blow yourself up, or I'm not sure that's a good idea. It would be, well, if you're going to do that, make sure you build a really big one. So it was just the environment that I grew up in, just had no limits in that respect.
My little boy and I shot a rocket up yesterday, and I was like, please, let's not lose a finger here. But I hear you on that. That's amazing. I love this quote of yours. You said, we have a saying here at Rocket Lab that we have no money, so we have to think. We've never been in a position to outspend our competitors. We just have to outthink them. What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, well, to that point, my two biggest competitors are the two wealthiest people on the planet. So there is no option to outspend. And what that really means is sometimes placing these kind of constraints, and I'm sure you see this in a lot of your startups, the startups that are like way overfunded almost, or extremely well funded, get kind of lazy and sloppy and are far less likely to succeed. The ones that really succeed well are the ones that are absolutely constrained and have to really think outside the box. And I think that has been an example for us, is like the kind of normal traditional approaches that you could take that just costs money, and you can buy your way out of a problem. We've never had that ability. We always, have to kind of outthink our way out of the problem. And what that ultimately manifests into is very unique solutions. We were the very first people to 3D print a rocket engine out of metal and send it to orbit. And at the time when we said we were going to 3D print a rocket engine, like 3D printing was used for bottle openers and cats prosthetics. It wasn't used for rocket engines. But, we could see that was the way out of a very complicated manufacturing process, as an expensive manufacturing process. Now, flip forward to today, and everybody 3D prints their rocket engine in one way or the other, and that's just the norm. So being so, heavily constrained really forces you to think and come up with, different solutions to the problems that ultimately end up, in our experience, to being competitive advantages.
Obviously, being a founder, a sense of urgency is critical, but you are building in a category that inherently takes longer to get to market, right? How do you balance that and create that sense of urgency, but the patience that's necessary? How do you think about that engine?
So let's be clear, I have no patience. So it is no different to anything else. And if you look at the time that it took us and the capital that it took us to get Electron to the pad, it was faster than just about anybody else, and certainly at a lower price than anybody else. And if you look at Neutron, a big rocket in development, once again, like it's a 4.5-year program, which is faster than ever before. So the reality is, it just takes a lot, because you're not just building a rocket, you're building a launch site, engine test facilities, and a lot of people focus on the rocket, but a lot of the capital actually turns into concrete, because you have to build just so much infrastructure to support the rocket. There's some things you have to be patient with, no doubt, but the timeline until you get a vehicle to the pad is just a function of the sheer magnitude of the infrastructure and everything you have to build. Like if you wrote everything down on a piece of paper, from launch sites through engine test facilities and factories, like you would look at, any sane person would look at that and go like, let's not do that. That just does not seem like it's a possible thing.
You're 20 years in, give or take. How do you stay motivated, and what are you most excited about when you think about the future of Rocket Lab and what's coming?
Well, firstly, it doesn't feel like 20 years. It literally feels like yesterday that I was in Silicon Valley raising my first $5 million. And you lose all sense of time in a rocket company, because it is just insane speed and work all of the time. And then, as I look forward to the company and what we're trying to build here, half of my brain is highly entrepreneurial and half of my brain is conservative engineer. So you can imagine the war that's occurring in there on a constantly daily basis. But nevertheless, for all of my sins, I'm very methodical in the way that we're trying to do these things. So, we started off with small launch, then we moved into spacecraft, now we're building a big rocket. And the end goal here, as I mentioned at the beginning, is to build this end-to-end space company where, if you look forward, the very large space companies of the future are not going to be the companies that just build a satellite or just build a rocket. In fact, these companies, it's going to be blurry about, are they a space company or are they a services company? And I think that's what truly excites me and that's what truly motivates me, because I think if you do that, the impact that you can have on the planet and all of the people that you can provide meaningful services to and change, really change the outlook on a number of things is huge. And wrapping that whole thing up into one nice little box of solution is, when I'll call it done.
When you think about things that worry you in outer space, I had a conversation the other night about space debris and the fact that we're sending up hundreds of satellites and they're all, there's like, who's organizing the logistics of things that are floating around the planet? And how do we play offense to space debris?
That's a great question. And normally I loathe any kind of regulation, as you can imagine. But this is one instance where I'm highly supportive of it. And I think there will have to be a point in time where we need kind of space traffic management. And the challenge with managing traffic in space is that it's all predictive. So a spacecraft is orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes. So if the orbit doesn't change, it's very predictive, right? You can determine at any point in time, taking into account various orbital decay, but any point in time where the spacecraft is going to be. But the challenge is that spacecraft are moving all the time. So your ability to predict where they're going to be is very, very difficult. And when you couple that with countries that don't like each other not sharing what they're doing with their spacecraft and how they're moving them, then we end up in the scenario right now where, literally people get calls at 2 a.m. in the morning saying, hey, in the next 2 hours, you're going to have a spacecraft smash into yours, so you better move it. At the moment, we have a relatively small number of satellites in orbit. Like if you took everything that's in orbit, it would all fit like in a football field. You could all jam it into a football field. So that, there's not that much stuff in orbit. But, that is changing very, very rapidly. I mean, Starlink is like a 30,000 satellite constellation. You have the Chinese constellation of similar numbers, a European. So before you know it, there's going to be a tremendous amount of traffic up there. And my biggest fear is actually that we don't preempt some of this and we do end up in a scenario where we've got a bit of a mess up there. And that'll take a bit of time to sort itself out. So I'm desperately hoping that for once in human history, we don't wait until it's a mess and then we go and fix it. We actually preempt the mess and put some regulation in place such that, everybody can globally adhere to and we can manage the traffic.
You said that the number of things in orbit is changing rapidly in a short period of time. Say more.
Yeah, so I think I can visualize the graph in my head, but I can't give you the numbers. But it's literally, it's a very exponential curve. Don't quote me on this, but something like we launched more in the last couple of years than all of history into orbit. So, it's a very exponential graph, and that's just going to continue to point to the sky. So in some respects, that's amazing because we're getting all these great services and all these new capabilities, but, it does need to be managed.
Building a company is stressful, but I have to imagine building literally a rocket company is more stressful than most companies that I've ever built. How do you manage stress? Because you've clearly gotten extremely good at it. You've gotten to the point where you've taken a company public in 2021. You've been very successful. You'll continue to be. But how have you learned to titrate your own stress?
Well, I don't do that well. Literally, it's like a forcing function. I have to do things that rely on me not thinking about the company. Otherwise, I'll just think about the company 24/7. So I'm a helicopter pilot. So when I climb into a helicopter, I have to not be thinking about Rocket Lab. Otherwise, I will die. And that's like a great forcing function to kind of remove your head out of the zone. And I find that those are the things that I have to do. Otherwise, it's a little bit of an unhealthy obsession.
What do you hold as sacred for a company? When you're building a business, there's sort of these visualizations or these rules in the back of your head that you will never break. For you, what's sacred?
Well, I mean, culture is the easy answer to that. But deeply within, more in that culture is, at Rocket Lab, we're very, very strict on only hiring the best. And I think every CEO says we only hire the best and all the rest of it. But I mean, I think we live this a lot more deeply. And it's twice as easy to get into Harvard than it is to get into Rocket Lab. And, we just hold that bar just super, super high. And then I would say that we're often asked, how come at one point we were tracking 140 small launch startups and now there's one? And the secret to that, I think, is, there's a number of things, but hustle is a really, really important kind of element within the company. And, it's very, very easy when someone puts up a big concrete block wall in front of you, the natural thing is to kind of stop at the wall and think about it for a while and and then, maybe you get a ladder and climb half of it and get scared and come back down. Well, that's not us. Like, if we come against a wall, there's no hesitation. We're out with our shovels and we'll just dig under it.
I'm going to move to the quick fire round.
Yep.
The first thing that comes to your mind, what gets you out of bed every day?
I have trouble sleeping, so that's generally not an issue anyway. But I'm super excited about trying to build what we build, and I have a huge sense of urgency. We need to get the company to this endpoint that I think will be, really beneficial for humanity, but also I think for the shareholders, of course. So I'm motivated every morning to get this thing built.
What's an interview question you like to ask people to get a sense of whether or not they should come to Rocket Lab?
By the time I'm interviewing somebody, their qualifications are taken for granted. Like, clearly they're the best. But you can be the best, but also not fit in and not fit into their company. So what I'm looking for is really understanding the person. And I like to know what people do outside work, because I think that tells you a lot about a person. For example, if you're a young engineer and outside work, you go home and you play video games, you're going to fail dismally at Rocket Lab. But if you go outside work and then you have a car you're building, or engineering just continues outside your work, then you're like a natural born engineer that just, that's all you think about 24/7, almost obsessive, then you're going to excel here.
When you think of your biggest pinch me moment to date, so a day in the company where you actually went home, went to bed and were like, I just can't believe that happened. What happened?
I would say it would have to be the capstone mission to the moon. So we bid on a mission to launch a small spacecraft. It's the very first part of the Artemis mission. NASA is turning to the moon Artemis mission to send a spacecraft into lunar orbit. And I mentioned before, there's a battle between the entrepreneurial side of the brain and the engineer side of the brain. And the entrepreneur is like, yes, let's do the most amazing thing possible. And the engineer is like, no, that's not fundamentally possible. That was one of those days where the entrepreneur just got a hold of the steering wheel. And we bid on this mission that was insanely difficult to do. I mean, we had to launch the spacecraft off a little rocket. And we spent the next 2 years just in absolute engineering hell trying to make this thing happen. We had to do 8 circularization burns of the spacecraft to get it to the moon. And every one of those 8 burns was just a miracle of engineering. And this is one of these things where you have to build an interplanetary spacecraft and double the performance of your rocket in 2 years. And everything has to work 100% perfect. And it's just such a complicated machine. And I remember that we finally did the last burn and sent the spacecraft on a trajectory to the moon. And that was certainly a pinch me moment, because if you'd asked any time during that 2-year period whether or not this was possible, I think the general consensus would be this is not possible. And the team pulled it off. And moreover, not only did we send it to the moon, we sent it to the moon with the most insane accuracy that you could possibly imagine. So it was a huge moment.
I mean, that may be the best answer of any pinch me moment I've ever gotten from a CEO. When you think of a quote you live by, a quote, a mantra, just sort of something that in the back of your head is like a guiding principle, is there one?
It's really, really important to me that we build really good stuff. And, I'm quoted as, I'm not built to build shit. And that is an absolute guiding principle. And whether it's everything, anything in Rocket Lab or anything outside Rocket Lab, I believe in the power of pride in your work and building stuff that is both beautiful and building stuff that is built well.
Is there a book that you've read of any kind, literally any kind, that has had a massive impact on you?
The rocket propulsion elements from Sutton, it's like the Godfather textbook on rocket propulsion. And I got my hands on that at a very early age. And I read that book from cover to cover dozens and dozens and dozens of times. And it's not what inspired me to build rockets, but if you read a book enough times, the very difficult things all of a sudden become seemingly simple. So when it came time to start building rockets, it had a good base knowledge, but also I came into it thinking, well, this isn't that hard, because I understood so many of the kind of fundamentals.
What is one thing you wish you knew before you started this business? So like a piece of advice you kind of wish someone could have paid it forward to you.
So this is an easy question. I would never want that, because I think if you wrote down all the stuff that you had to do, you would never in a million years start it. And I'm not one to look back and look at these kind of things. That would be the most destructive thing that you could possibly do, because so many things are seemingly impossible that you would never even try.
Last question, serious one. UFOs, what do you think?
Well, I mean, is there life outside Earth? I think statistically, probability is really, really high. Hence the reasons why we have the Venus life-finding mission. I guess I'm a little bit more scientific about it than green men coming down and probing me. But I think probably there is life outside us here on the planet. But like I say, the engineering in me needs the proof, and we're going to try and get that proof. And I think if you can prove there is life, then I think it does certainly lead a little bit more credibility to some of the UFO stories. A little bit, not tremendous amount for sure.
No, I love it. And I'm totally smiling because that was exactly what I wanted to ask you. Sir Peter Beck, it has been an absolute pleasure. With all my heart, I sincerely mean this. Thank goodness that people like you exist on this planet, people who've devoted their life to moving all of us, humanity, forward in such a massive way. And I really just mean that from the bottom of my heart. It is not just your talent and your entrepreneurship. It's the selflessness that goes into what you're doing. And you just said it, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There really are no breaks. And I'm just so grateful. And everybody out there, if you want to check out more, you can go to rocketlabusa.com. And you can find me here next week with a new episode of For Starters with Alex Von Tobel. Sir Peter Beck, what an honor. You're incredible.
Thanks very much. Very kind. Thank you.